A good contract is worth its weight in gold. Are you a creative entrepreneur who contracts your services to others? Well, listen up, because this is for you. The Smithers Law Group has created 14 master contracts specifically for creative entrepreneurs. These contracts are industry specific, they're fully customizable, and you only pay a one-time fee. This is so much better and more affordable than speaking with an attorney who's going to charge you an hourly consultation fee, and it's so much more secure than just Googling up your contract and hoping for the best. Find your fully customizable and industry-specific contract at stulawgroup.com. Search for the contract link. And don't forget to tell them that I sent you.
I was perplexed when a white friend I'd known for many years came to deny every instance of racism that I decried with, "There's always another possible explanation. It doesn't always have to lead back to the plantation." But often it did, so I started staying quiet. Until one day, a woman no less than 70 years old looked at me with a hate so great that my friend didn't need to be told that it was a hate born of times of old.
Repeat after me. I bring more than diversity. I bring irreplaceable perspectives. Hey friends, my name is Whitney, and I'm the host of Impostrix Podcast, the show that validates professionals of color navigating imposter syndrome and racial toxicity in their career. Join us and be validated. You got this. Hi, and welcome back to Impostrix Podcast. I'm your host, Whitney Knox Lee. I'm here today with Will Fullwood, and I am looking forward to this conversation. Will and I spoke for quite a while, a couple of days ago on his podcast, Contraband Wagon, and our conversation took many twists and turns. One of the things that he brought up, though, was that he's reading from MLK's body of work. And one of the quotes that MLK had brought up, which I'm going to let him talk about in a bit, but it kind of got us on this conversation of like, what is the issue that we're dealing with racially here in the United States? And then once we know the issue, like, how do we solve this issue? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Will, can you go ahead and introduce yourself and share with us the identities that you bring to this space?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, first of all. As you said, my name is Will Fullwood, aka Contraband, creator of the Contraband Wagon. So I do come to you as a live streamer and podcast host, and as a Black gay man who is also a community college professor teaching mathematics and English. So it's a pleasure to be here and just share my thoughts.
Yes, thank you. One of the things we talked about on Will's show, so Will does the Contraband Wagon, does like a 2-hour live stream on Twitch on Fridays. And so I was with him just this past week, and I've never been on Twitch before, so that was pretty cool. But also he asked me, okay, Whitney, so I am going to open this up so that you can ask me a question that you want to ask me. And all I could think of was like, why the fuck does this man say mathematics instead of just like math? Like, I don't know, the rest of us. And it's a long, you'll have to go listen to his show because it's a long, very interesting answer. But okay, so before we jump into the conversation, this episode is airing on or around Juneteenth, and I think that it's really important to just talk briefly about Juneteenth. Juneteenth is a holiday that I became familiar with when I was in middle school because my father at his law firm basically encouraged the firm to start celebrating Juneteenth, which in hindsight, I think is really interesting because this was a mostly white firm in mostly white Seattle, where my dad was probably one of a few Black partners, if not the only Black partner at this firm. And in the summers, they would have all sorts of parties, and one of the parties would be a Juneteenth party. And I was confused about what Juneteenth was, what day is Juneteenth. And so, that was really where I started to learn about Juneteenth, was through this recognition that my dad's law firm would, give to Juneteenth. So, by way of the history, for those that are not familiar, Juneteenth is June 19th, and it is a celebration of the anniversary of the day when word got to the last enslaved Black people in Galveston Bay, Texas, that they were free, that they had been emancipated. As you know, slavery was outlawed and indentured servitude was outlawed in not 19, no, 1863, January 1st, 1863, through the Emancipation Proclamation, 13th Amendment. We also know, though, that slavery is still legal as a form of punishment for people who have been convicted of crimes. Essentially, slave labor and indentured servitude is still legal. And we see that in our jails and prisons, where we have people working for literal cents to the hour and without any kind of protection from the elements or protections from occupational hazards, stuff like that. So it wasn't until 2 years later, on June 19th, 1865, that the Union troops made it to Galveston to tell enslaved people that they were free. So we celebrate Juneteenth as kind of Black Liberation Day, as Black Freedom Day, um, because that is the day when everyone who was Black who was enslaved by that point knew that they were free. Is there anything you want to add to that, Will?
I thought that was just a very perfect summary, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And the only thing I would add, I guess, is that the reason why it's so important is because, to the top of the mountain and the edge of the sea, it's all our responsibility to deal with racism. That's part of a poem that I wrote for the Contraband Wagon. You can see that on my YouTube channel. But it reminds me of the fact that we're all in this together, and that if not everybody knows that you're free, then you're not free.
Then you ain't free.
No. Right. If everybody isn't acting as if you're free, then you're not free. And that's kind of the impetus of my show. And that's what it made me think of when you were telling your story. So thanks for that.
Yeah, and I think that takes us into our discussion for today. So, can you tell us about, first of all, what you're doing with Contraband Wagon and this book club that you're doing? It sounds like you're reading from MLK's work, and that sparked for you all recently a conversation about what the problem is that we're dealing with here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, just a little background on the Contraband Wagon. It got started as a live group where I would get people from my local community together to have conversations about the subject of race and racism. And we had people from, all demographics that you can imagine. And everything was amazing. People found value from all different walks of life. And ultimately, we had to shut it down due to the pandemic, and we went virtual because of that. So this was always meant to be a live thing, just to put that out there, because we are returning to our live events now. But ultimately, because we went virtual, we were able to kind of extend it to the international waters, and see people from all over the world who have perspectives about this subject matter. And as part of that, we created the book club, which is just meets on our Discord channel. And we just have conversations right now about Dr. King's Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. And we meet about once every few weeks or whatnot. You can sign up on my meetup group if you like to check that out. And ultimately, we noticed that in the early chapters of this book, Dr. King is really kind of laying out the framework of the problem, right? And he talks about the problem from many different angles. He talks about it in terms of the legacy of white supremacy. He talks about it in terms of Black power and kind of the impetus of Black power and the usefulness of Black power, and what Black power can do for us and what it can't do for us. He talks about it from a political perspective. He talks about it from a peace perspective. So he's really looking at it from a multidimensional analysis. And it just sparked a lot of good conversation, like you said. But really, for me, since my kind of thing is talking about race specifically, I kind of honed in on the parts where he talked about white supremacy and how we need to overcome white supremacy. And when he kind of described what the problem was, he just talked about the differing perspectives that people who are racialized differently are kind of raised to have, and how that manifests in a movement for racial justice. So, one quote that really stands out is when he said something about the fact that white people, white liberals who were like invested in the civil rights movement at the time, he said it became apparent that they were more interested in an end to brutality. Okay. Whereas black people were interested in seeking equality and equal rights. And those two things were not the same. And that became apparent at a certain part of the struggle where people were like, okay, like, they're not sicking dogs after you. They're not, blowing you away with fire hoses anymore. They're letting you kind of participate in society a little bit. What more do you want? Like, this is over, isn't it? And black people were oh yeah, no, that's not what we were doing. And so there were these dual issues, actually. One was, this differential in intention along racial lines. And then the other was the fact that a lot of the institutions, civil rights institutions that have been built up over time, they weren't really designed for the next phase of the struggle. And that is why we've kind of watched through the decades since then, they've kind of been fracturing. And now I think they're pretty much, I would say, unrecognizable from what they once were, and also not useful for what we're trying to do moving forward unless they're repurposed. So that's kind of what I got out of the discussion. There's a lot more. I mean, these discussions, people come from all over, like I said, and they bring a lot to the discussion. So I encourage everyone to come, but that's kind of the basic foundation for us to start with.
Hey, y'all. So let's switch gears for just a minute. We talk so much about empowerment of folks of color on this show. And now I want to take a second to talk about our legacy. It's so important that as we're out here doing our thing and making that money and trying to be the people that we want to be for our communities and families, that we get our estate plan together. And I know estate planning can be overwhelming. We've got your back. Our team is here to guide you every step of the way. Wills for the People is an estate planning practice that prioritizes creating and advancing generational wealth, particularly within families of color and middle-class families. This is because it's so important that we just get started. So, what do you want your legacy to be? And what steps have you taken to ensure that that happens? Take those steps with Wills for the People, where intentional planning meets transformative results. Visit our website for your free consultation at willsforthepeoplega.com. Mention Impostrix Podcast and we'll give you 10% off of your package. All right, I'll see you over there. Let's get back to the show. Yeah, and this makes so much sense to me. I haven't read this book, and I will. And I'm interested in actually joining you guys for these conversations because I think it's a great idea. But it makes a lot of sense to me, this observation that white liberals, the good white people, are concerned about brutality. They're concerned about physical harm coming to Black bodies. They're concerned about, the blatant kind of treatments or mistreatment, I guess, of Black bodies and images that you might see of Black bodies or brown bodies being brutalized is, of course, a shock to the conscience. And so this observation that, like, okay, yeah, so these white humans can't ignore that. Like, they can't ignore that. So we have to stop that. And then the observation that today, as we are navigating the systemic effects of racism and of white supremacy, that take more work to uncover. like takes more data, takes more tracking of trends to see that, whatever the statistics are around Black home ownership, the statistics around the racial wealth gap, um, the statistics around health and, Black female mortality, in childbirth, and all of the disparities that we now have, but that aren't in your face violence towards Black people. That is so difficult to kind of get people on board around activism and around advocacy and the sense of urgency, we're not seeing compared to when we're seeing Breonna Taylor be murdered and George Floyd be murdered and Ahmaud Arbery be murdered and then Philando Castile and all of the people. And that really rings true to me as far as what the problem is. And it's that white people, good white people, people in general, I actually think that nobody wants to see any single person, any single body suffering from that physical brutality. And like that is the problem. And that is going to create a crisis that is going to create some sense of urgency that we need to respond. And that's where it ends. And as you said, as Dr. King said, that is not, yes, sure, Black people want to be physically safe. We don't want to be beaten and killed in the streets. We don't want dogs, chasing us. We don't want some of these things that have happened in our history. We don't want to be enslaved. And we want to be free. We want to be treated like humans just like everybody else. And it's really interesting for me because I guess I'm realizing that for me, those two things are aligned, but for other people, they're not.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I mean, it's easier for those things to be aligned for you and me who are racialized as Black because, you know, it's more natural, I guess, given our life experiences to come to that conclusion, right? But if you're on the higher upper end, if you will, of a racial hierarchy, then you're not feeling the same kind of effects. You're not being forced to perceive the world the same way. You're not being forced to consider the same questions. In fact, you're being encouraged not to. And so it's created this differential in thought and this differential in experience. And then combine that with the fact that Black people's experience is then devalued and dismissed as not being important. And you've created a situation where there's no real pathway for racialized white people to understand our actual lives.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a very sneaky mechanism that exists within white supremacy that is hard to discuss because unless you have some kind of familiarity with it, this concept would kind of elude you. But for hopefully for some listeners out there, they understand that this differential exists, and then the devaluing of our experience leaves no way for racialized white people unless they seek out that information, right? Like, I mean, it's not like we can't learn about each other, right? Like, I mean, I've met people from all over the world. I taught for many years in New York City. I taught people from almost every continent, and so you know, I there are ways of learning what other people experience. There are ways of learning things that you're never going to experience. Now, will you learn it on the same level of the same dimension that the person who actually experienced it did? Absolutely not. That's not realistic. But what I found is that a lot of people, they just don't want to try. It
Mm.
actually reminds me of a story, Whitney.
Yeah.
So I was reconnecting with a friend um, who I went to high school with. And we were on a nature walk talking and whatnot. And this subject came up. He is actually a Russian immigrant to the United States. And, he was saying at that time, oh, I just can't imagine what it would be like to be a Black person. And, I just, in that moment, I was like, you know what? I can't let you off the hook with that, bro. Like, we've known each other for so long, like, you say it's so difficult and you can never understand, but I'm like, you could try. That was my response. I was like, you could try. Like, it was, you could tell he was using it as a reason not to try at all. And when I called him out on that, he actually had no response. He kind of just pretended like I didn't say that and moved on. And so, I've had a lot of those moments where you reveal that, like, ultimately the issue is a lot of racialized white people are not really put to a choice, uh, or at least put to consciously think about their choices in the race context. What are you going to do? What are you going to do knowing the world is the way it is? What are you going to do if you gain this knowledge about what your fellow American citizens who are racialized as Black or not racialized as white are enduring under an oppressive system? Like, what are you going to do about that? And that is the question that racialized white people are encouraged not to think about, not to consider. And there really is very few opportunities for them to consider it, because of the way white supremacy has manifested in our society. It hasn't created space for those conversations. It hasn't created space for those considerations. If anything, our governments, both federal and state, seem to be dead set on making sure that we never consider these questions, and that's based on the laws that are passed. I call them protect white children's feelings laws. That make sure that we're only teaching things that are not going to make anyone feel bad about race, which I don't know how that's possible. But we've got to somehow find a way to get around that, because there's nowhere we're going in a world that's designed so that we don't have these conversations where we're going to actually get people to an enlightened enough state about the subject matter to make a conscious choice to be anti-racist. And ultimately, for me, I want us as a country to take on anti-racism as a value, which I think during our conversation, you were like, that's like, woo, but I know it's imaginary. I know it doesn't exist right now. I know it's a lofty goal, but ultimately, I do think it's something that we can unify around if we raise everyone's consciousness around the subject of race.
Yeah. And the thought that, so I'm having several thoughts at the same time. One of them is around this idea of making anti-racism personal, of taking that personally. And that for some of us who are racialized as other than white, often our anti-racism is personal because it directly impacts us. And of course, you and I are coming to this conversation as Black people, but non-Black people of color as well. We are racialized beings, and we are not at the top of the hierarchy. And this system of white supremacy, this hierarchy, this racialization, this racial capitalization benefits white people. And so not only is it counterintuitive or kind of counter their interests, they being white people, to interrogate this ideology and white supremacy and the hierarchy. But it's also, as you have mentioned, not, the space for that does not really exist. And so the opportunity for white people to take anti-racism personally and to act on anti-racism as if their life depends on it can be so far from their actual reality, because their life doesn't depend on it. And in fact, their life depends on continued systems of white supremacy.
Precisely.
So
Exactly.
that's one thought. The second thought that I am having is around this I want to say it's not quite as clear as gaslighting, but it's around this notion that even I experience and have experienced throughout my childhood and adulthood as a Black person, of almost dismissing the non-violent, non-direct racial harm. And we talked about this at the outset. We talked about, white people not wanting to see Black people being brutalized. And I'm realizing in this conversation that characteristic of white supremacy, I'm seeing that in myself in terms of my own personal history. And you and I talked about this a little bit a couple of days ago with just the confusion that we experience when our experiences of racism aren't the experiences that kind of we're told to look out for. It's not the experiences necessarily of being followed around in stores because we're Black and not trusted. It's not the experiences of being spit on. It's not the experiences of being beaten up or, targeted, or there being, a burning cross on my front lawn. It's not those experiences. And throughout my life, I've been really unsure of what I am experiencing when I'm experiencing what I feel like is racial harm, but that doesn't quite fit, the narrative that we are taught in school, or that is highlighted in white liberal media as the bad thing. And now, as an adult, where we are seeing so many, and in my circle it's Black women, but so many Black people talking about the racial toxicity that they're experiencing within their workplaces, and how difficult it is for us to put their finger on something, to put, to explicitly name what they're experiencing, and how difficult it is for outsiders, for bystanders to also be able to identify that what we're experiencing, what's happening right now, is racial toxicity. And how can we be anti-racist if we can't, if we can't identify that this dynamic that we're in is a dynamic of white supremacy, is a dynamic that is racially toxic. um and so I think, this is one of the major hurdles that we are having to overcome right now. I think this is some of the job of educators, whether that's more formal traditional schooling or whether that's in DEI trainings and stuff like that, is expanding our understanding as a people of what racism looks like, of what white supremacy looks like, that we're not talking about the KKK. We are talking about Susan down the hall. And we're not even talking about purposeful, blatant acts. We're talking about ignorance. We're talking about she made a decision that had nothing to do with me, she thought, but actually has everything to do with me, and she just wasn't thinking about me. And so I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I mean, it's complicated, right? Because it's all about, a lot of it is about perception, and our perception improves over time and with experience. And so there's really not much that can be done when you haven't developed the perceptive powers to interpret what you're experiencing, right? You're just going to feel little needle pricks, and it's going to hurt, and you're not going to know why you're hurting. And then until you figure it out, right? Who's holding the needle. And it's very unfortunate, but like, I don't really see any way around that except for exactly what you said, right? Is education about what's possible and what's out there. I know that in my virtual racism discussion groups that I run at the end of every month, a lot of people give me feedback that they're thankful to hear some of the stories that people share because it gives them insight into what can happen. And we can strategize once in a while about how to actually deal with it, which is good. But yeah, I mean, that kind of confusion that you're talking about, I think all racialized Black people go through it in some way, shape, or form at some time in their life, I believe. I mean, there's so many stories that come to mind. Just let me start by saying from where you started, which is how racialized white people are situated in the hierarchy and what that complication brings. I think that while it's true the racial hierarchy benefits racialized white people, one thing that we don't talk about enough is that it significantly burdens them. And I don't think that that narrative, I mean, that narrative is basically non-existent in the race discourse. And I feel like changing that will go a long way into talking about race as it actually operates in our society and on humans. I think that we've gotten a little bit far from the reality in terms of our discourse on it. And I think that's one of the biggest problems, is because there's this kind of ideological fight, if you will, about how we're going to characterize race, how we're going to characterize racism, what is woke, what is not woke, like all of these little things. We got propagandists thrown into the mix doing their thing. So right now, it's a very important time in our struggle for racial justice, because we need to make sure, I think we being Black Americans specifically, we have to take control of the narrative about what race is and what racism is, because we actually know best. Whether the rest of the country wants to accept that or not, or believe that or not, that's the reality of just our experience and what we've been through the generations, and the knowledge that we've stored, and the sacrifices our people have made. And so to me, that's undeniable. And we've got to honor that sacrifice by making sure that we don't let anyone take control of this narrative at this point in human history. I think it's extremely important. So that's one of the reasons why I started doing what I'm doing, because now that we have this amazing technology where you and I can talk across borders, right? We've got to use it, and we've got to connect people, and we've got to connect people's hearts so that we can open them up. And that's what I'm trying to do. And the next thing I want to say, you talked about microaggressions, and one that I think that actually came to mind while you were speaking about it. So I was working as a student worker, undergraduate student for the School of Nursing at the University of Rochester, where I went to undergrad. And I was just kind of helping people out here and there. I was known as the copy king, because I would make copies for everybody. And they were like, oh my God, you're so good at this. I don't know who they had working for them before, but apparently somebody who can do
copies.
Right? Exactly. Yeah. Copy king. I took people up and down the freight elevator sometimes, like little stupid things like that, well, there's this whole other story about me, like literally drafting a textbook for someone and never getting credit for it. But that's like a whole nother story. But the story that came to mind was one where I was asked by one of the professors to deliver some flowers to an office. So I did that, right? And then later I'm checking in with her about something else. She's a racialized white woman. And she goes, hey, did you deliver those flowers? And I'm like, yeah, I delivered them and put them in the office. And she goes, oh my God, you did so good. Like, great job. She's like, you should think about doing that for a living. And I was just like,
flowers.
Right. Apparently. Yeah. Like, meanwhile, I'm like,
because they got to where they were intended to go. Like,
right. Like, I mean, I didn't know where to place that comment, right? Like, when I first heard it, I was confused. I'm like, what is, like, who would say that? Why? And I actually did not have a framework under which to think of it, because at that time I didn't have the sophisticated lens that I have developed over these years about race and racism. But like, I also knew that I had no framework to understand it at all. Like, I was like, I don't know why she would say that. Why would, there was no, I'm a undergraduate in college. Obviously I'm getting a college degree, probably not so I can go deliver flowers. And since I deliver flowers around the corner of the hall, why would that be something that you would, be so expressive and like, say I did such a good job like that for? None of it made sense. Now, eventually I did kind of think about maybe it was like a racial thing. So I went to verify with another one of my friends, racialized white woman who worked with me. And what did she do? She tried to explain it away. And she's actually a character in my poem. Her stanza goes like this. I was perplexed when a white friend I known for many years came to deny every instance of racism that I decried with, there's always another possible explanation. It doesn't always have to lead back to the plantation. But often it did, so I started staying quiet. Until one day, a woman no less than 70 years old looked at me with a hate so great that my friend didn't need to be told that it was a hate born of times of old. So I put that in there because it's so interesting. I would have these experiences. I would, try to talk to her about them. She would immediately come up with every other possible explanation for it other than racism. And then there was this one instance where literally a woman just looked at me and she could see the hate in this woman's eyes. She saw it so clearly that it was undeniable for her and she was there. So therefore that made the difference for her, even though this was probably one of the most mildest, meaningless encounters that I'd had throughout this time. And interestingly enough, I have confronted this person about this very thing, and she did acknowledge, what she did. But has she changed her behavior? No. Did she say she would? Yeah. So, I mean, this is the battle that racialized white people are going through. They have their internal battle, but it doesn't just affect them, right? It's going to affect their relationships with people of color. And like, we're basically not friends anymore because of this, because
Yeah.
I can no longer wait for her to decide to acknowledge me as like an equal human and my life experience as it actually is, right? So there's all these complications in moving this forward because there is no moving it forward without racialized white people. It's unfortunate. It's an unfortunate reality. I do wish that there was enough power within minoritized, communities, minority communities to change things. But ultimately, that's not the reality in which we are living. And so we have to find a way to bridge the gap, as I always say.
Yeah.
Across these racial divisions that have happened, that have cut, not only across our rights as citizens, but it's cut down to the level of thought. It's created a division down to the level of the way we think and experience life. So if we're going to deal with that, and the government is going to make sure that, they're not aiding us in really dealing with that, then it's going to take a grassroots effort that is gargantuan in order to do that. And I decided the first place to start is with opening people up to the conversation because, frankly, a lot of people are just not having it, or they're having it too late before it can have a serious impact, or they're getting misinformation too early that is too difficult and painful for them to unravel. A lot of racialized white people who come on my show talk about the pain they experience from realizing that they were lied to their whole lives, that they were taught white supremacist ideas, that they were told untruths about people of color, that they were denied that human experience of connecting with people of color and the joy and the wealth of knowledge and experience that it brings to their life. And
because we're the best.
Right? I mean, come on. Like, I mean, we're everywhere for a reason. And it's just like, but it's scary to people that we're so great, right? Like our greatness scares people.
It's a threat. And it always has been a threat.
Exactly. And that's why, some of the earliest Black people, poets, musicians, farmers, steel workers, we were always a threat because of the skills and knowledge that we contain. And those threats always had to be contained and controlled. And that mindset has really never left the consciousness of American power. And what I mean by that is people in power in America of all racial groups, including Black Americans. So it's a gargantuan task that we have to overcome something like that. But ultimately, the power lies where it always has. It still lies with the people. And ultimately, the problem is that we haven't organized ourselves in a way that threatens or forces the government's hand. And that is actually what Dr. King recommends in his book. Now, I think his ideas about how to do that are maybe a little bit outdated at this time. I don't think he really had the full foresight, and who did, to understand advances in technology and what can be accomplished now. But the basic idea for a solution is still the same. Build a system of power that is anti-racist that can force the government to act. Because we do need government power also. I think that's another unfortunate truth. So Yeah, it is a slim needle we are trying to thread. But that's where hope lies in this context. And ultimately, if you've ever seen, for all my anime nerds out there, I'm a huge anime fan, by the way. If you've seen Hunter x Hunter, if the king can do it, then so can we. All right? Because that's what we are. We are kings and queens. So let's do this.
Yeah, and I think the reality is this isn't happening in our lifetimes. And I think thinking about it in that way takes a little bit of the pressure off for me. As skeptical as I am that this is even possible, I realize that I don't necessarily need to worry about whether or not it's possible. I just need to like do my part while I'm here without expecting to see the change that I'm working for necessarily.
That's the
Um,
hardest part for a lot of people I talk to. I remember I
mhm.
talked to this documentary film worker, and he made this documentary about education in Black America with all these Black educators and administrators. And he's like, I want to show this everywhere, but like people are not like following up and this and that. He's like, I've been doing this for 10 years. I'm not really sure. And I'm like, yeah, bro, like this is how it is. When you do this work, people are not going to invite you with open arms because that's the society in which we live. One in which you're not welcome, one in which your content is not welcome. You have to find those spaces where people are welcome you, where they're interested in change, and we need to be strategic in targeting that.
Yeah. And I think about this a lot now since it's an election year, of course. And I think about, various aspects of our conversation. I think about who we have running for president here in the United States and the discourse around what is and is not racist, what is and is not racially harmful. If you're voting for Trump, how can you possibly say that you're not racist? Or how can you possibly have, friends that are people of color or friends that are poor people? Or, and again, it makes so much sense as we are having these conversations that people can't see some of the subtleties, some of the domino effects that some of the policies that Trump and Biden have put into place or will put into place or are campaigning on. They don't see that trickle effect as racism because they're not following it all the way down. And I think a big part of our work again is the making that more clear, is kind of rolling back maybe the idea that racism and racist action looks like KKK and lynchings and slavery and all of that. And instead, I don't want to say normalizing because obviously we don't want this to be normal, but it is normal, right? It's normal for us. It's no our experience is
But the thing
experiencing
is,
race.
it's normal for them too. That's the key. It's normal for all of us.
Mm,
And so, like, that is the key because that is where our universal experience lies. And
right.
so, we don't actually need to. I do agree with you that we need to show that link between the past and present. But I think it's more important now to show people in their very lives. We
Yeah.
don't need to go anywhere else. They need to think about their own lives and their own experiences and identify where they turned a blind eye. And we know that those things exist for people.
I've found it so hard recently. There's one group that I'm working with in particular that there's a block. Like there's a block with getting there. And I find that so fascinating. And of course, like I can't really relate. And so I find it so fascinating that we can talk about equity and we can talk about inclusion and we can talk about access and be not willing to interrogate our own selves. And I think, for folks listening, that's one of the real hopes that I have for listeners of this podcast is that as we're listening to conversations, we are able to take these conversations and apply them to our own selves and interrogate like what's going on, no matter how good we feel like we are. And no matter how good we actually are, because I'm gonna venture to say that everybody listening to this is actually a good person, um, and there's so much for us to learn. There's so much for me to learn as an individual, as a Black racialized woman, um, and to just identify my complicity along the way. Because I too, particularly as a middle class, upper middle class Black person, have benefit a lot from the racialized hierarchy, even though I'm a Black person.
Precisely.
Because,
And so have I. And so have I. And
right,
I'm very cognizant of that. Yeah.
because I operate in the world of whiteness and I'm well versed. I grew up, I speak the language, I'm well versed. And that is currency, that's power. Um, and you had mentioned power. You had mentioned I forget the words that you used, but the Americanized system of power that we have in politics. And I think that is so important, especially again, as we're in an election year, for us to be considering is what it means for us as Americans to have power. And if we kind of take that down a notch and think about in our workplaces or in our communities, what is the power that we hold? Why do we hold that power? How have we come to hold that power? And what do we do with that power? Because we all have some levels of power, whether that be at our family level or in work or in elected politics. And my question, in addition to these how, what, whys, is are we able to share our power? Or are we hoarding power? And if we're hoarding the power, what is it that we're afraid of? Or why? Why do we need to have all of the power? Why do we think that we are the best person to have that power? And I think these are questions that we don't ask ourselves because what we learn in this system of white supremacy, in this system of oppression, is that power is the best. And if we have it, never let it go.
That's right. And that's why we have 80-year-old men running for president, right? Like, yeah. So it's very true. I think it's one of the biggest shames of our country right now that we don't know how to give up power.
Mm,
Like, I think I don't know why. I mean, I do know why, but like I think it's juvenile to think that the point of life is to get as much power as possible and money as possible and then die. I think that is foolish.
mhm.
um, but that is what a lot of people think. I've literally had people tell me that the only reason that they wake up in the morning is to try to make as much money as possible. I've had people tell me that, if making as much money as possible isn't what you're doing with your life, then what else could you possibly be doing? Unable to imagine another reason for living. So that is definitely what our country has trained people to believe. And obviously, aside from just the wealth inequality that we're all facing, which is going to make those dreams an impossibility for virtually everyone, um, like I think that there's way more to life than making money. There's way more to life than having power. But if your goal is to be an anti-racist, you need look no further than your own self and your own life to find where the power lies. I want to reemphasize that.
Yes.
Um, all you need to do is take a small step, educate yourself, educate someone else, start the conversation. That's it. You'd be surprised how far the ripples that you create by starting a conversation will go. Are you going to change the world by starting a conversation? Probably not. Okay. But are you going to impact your local community? Absolutely. Are you going to impact your friend group or your family group? Yes. Are you going to pay a price for starting that conversation? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe you benefit from it. Maybe you find that there's burdens from it. Okay. But the point is, regardless of the outcome, if you choose to take on anti racism as a value, you're going to accept the outcome as it comes, good, bad, ugly, all of it. And that is where we need to get people to is a reconfiguration of our values. And if our values are what we say they are, and this goes for everybody of every racial group, okay, especially Black people, all right, if your values are anti-racism, what are you doing? What are your actions? Are they in line with that? And if you have already made those values a part of your family unit, what about beyond your family unit? Because we have to think beyond that. We must organize as a collective. It's imperative. It's something we've been talking about for generations and decades and generations, but it's time. We need to do it now, and we need to start building our collective power and organizing that power with purpose. And that is something that we've yet been able to really, truly accomplish. I'd say the civil rights movement is like the closest approximation of that at a national level. But now we need to build something greater. I don't know who will hear this. I don't know if some of our wealthy, racialized Black Americans out there might hear this podcast, but I hope you do. And I hope you consider, what are you doing with all those dollars? Because our community has enough money at this point to disrupt a lot more than we are disrupting. And so for me, because I have knowledge of that, I question what a lot of Black Americans with a lot of money are doing with that money. Because if we wanted to be anti-racist at the highest levels, then we would be seeing more visible and tangible results of the disruption that people with money, power, and influence are bringing. So that is my challenge to the upper crust.
You speaking to me. Now, I'm not wealthy, but I certainly could control better where my money is going and whether or not it's staying in my community or whether or not I am funding the things that I don't want to be funding. So thank you for that reminder and that challenge. Okay, we're going to wrap up. One of the things that I ask every guest on my show is about the mantra or affirmation that you are living with in this season. So tell us, what is it? What's the mantra affirmation that helps you right now?
Lead with loving one. Lead with loving one. That's what I say.
Lead with loving one?
That's right. You lead, you start by loving one person.
Okay.
Yourself. It's self-love.
Awesome.
You must start by loving yourself. Then you go to number 2. That's somebody else. Okay. And then you go from there. All right. But you got to start here.
Awesome. Okay. So where can we find you, Will?
You can find me on Twitter at Contrabands with an SM at the end. It was supposed to be Contraband's mouth, but that's what I got. And you can find me on YouTube. The Contraband Wagon is the name of the show. You can follow me on Twitch at the same name, The Contraband Wagon. You can find me on Discord by following me at my meetup group, www.meetup.com/racism discussion group. And there you can find all of the events that the Contraband Wagon presents, and you can RSVP as well. Links to the Discord, the book club, everything you want to be involved in, my round robin discussion, virtual groups, the live discussions, everything's there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Will, for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for joining me for this conversation. I hope that you got as much out of it as I did. Feel free to continue the conversation with us over on Facebook at the Impostrix Podcast Validating Space. We welcome all, and it's a space for us to validate each other as we work through work, race, and imposter syndrome. You can find out more about me or about the podcast at www.impostrixpodcast.com. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram at Impostrix Podcast. Until next time, be validated.